Okay, well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to week 9 of Making Sense of Learning and New Technologies. And good to see we have a nice rollout here with Damien, Emma, Eric, and I think that is, oh, there goes Eric. And I think that's Sarah, is it? Wonderful, thanks, Sarah. And hopefully Eric will be rejoining us. There he comes. Okay, so this week brings us into the last of our modules. We've had a range of modules that we've looked at over the last few weeks of the course. We started off with looking at educational futures and some of the theory around looking at where education might be going. Then we did a module looking at the whole range of educational technologies that are available. The last few weeks we've been looking at learning environments and policies and how classrooms can be equated to systems, and systems can be equated to whole countries in terms of different levels of policy analysis that can be done to set up an environment for learning. And this leads us now into our final module, which is looking at how to influence change. And this evening, we're going to look at some traditional educational models. Next week, we're going to look at some emerging educational models. And then we're going to finish up in 2 weeks' time in terms of course content around the transformative processes that are available to shift from traditional to emerging educational models. So does that make some sense? Now I'm working through your assignments for the first assignment and they're looking pretty good so far. So that's wonderful. And you should be starting to frame, and we'll be discussing your second assignment, which is your implementation plan for how to transform a particular learning organization, be that a classroom, a school, a system, or a country, depending upon what level you wish to engage with. Now, many of you will decide to do that around a real organization, and that's fine. That's to be encouraged and makes it then more useful to you. But of course, you may not choose to do that. It's an assignment. It's not a real policy document. You may turn it into a real policy document. That's up to you. But for the purposes of this course, it's not a real policy document. And you can make stuff up for it. So you could decide to do it around a country, even though you may not be working at a country level, or you may decide to do it around a classroom or anywhere in between. And of course, it will draw upon what you've done for your first assignment. And that's where I hope to get the feedback to you for that this week so that you can start reflecting upon that in terms of how what you explored in your first assignment can now extend into the development of a policy document for how to implement some of the ideas that you came up with through your Delphi study and your futures scoping, creating scenarios about what the future might be like if some of the ideas that you've explored were put into practice. So that frames the last module. Any questions around that? Now, to be wonderful, we've got a nice cohort here together. We can have lots of discussion. Yes, Damien, I'll have the feedback to you hopefully by the end of this week. And you'll then be able to take that on board and explore it. But many of the ideas from the course you should be starting to think about now in terms of how you would implement this in terms of creating an implementation plan. And of course, the main aspect is creating an implementation plan that is likely to be successful. Anyone can come up with a plan, and lots of people have, but history has taught us that not all of them work particularly effectively. And we're going to look at some of the strategies and ways that you can go about implementing ideas for transformative change that have a higher likelihood of success. Okay, so we've got a number of readings that we're going to explore tonight. And they're based around traditional educational models. And the first one is an exploration by Chandler, who looked at two models of educational practice, comparing traditional versus progressive schools as they were described, particularly in the United States, in the 60s and 70s. But if there's no other questions, then we'll get started into those readings. If you could open them up and have them available, even though you may not have gone through them in great depth. Of course, it would be fantastic if you had gone through them in great depth. The discussions would likely be more complex and nuanced, but I understand that that may not be the case. Thanks, Eric. So Nia said she wrote a mail but did not receive a mail back. I presume you're referring to an email. I don't see anything from her. She sent an email asking about the log of completion activities and when that's due. It will be due at the same time as your second assignment. So if there was a mistake somewhere that it might be mentioning that it was due on the 15th of September, that's incorrect. I'll correct that. I'll just have to go through and track down where that might be. But no, your log of learning activities is due at the end of the course. And for our purposes, that is the due date for your second assignment. Yeah, there's no rush on getting that done. And the reality is it's just simply a checklist of various things that you may have completed. And I would expect most of you to get 100% for the log of learning activities. It's just designed to prompt you to complete various things during the course and to get some credit for doing that. But it's not onerous. It's pass fail. Well, it's in terms of you do it or you don't do it and you get the marks for it. There's no criteria related to that in terms of the quality involved. We are permitted to give 20% of your assessment to what's called completion activities, and that's what that is. So don't be stressed about the completion activities. It's very unlikely that you would not get that done effectively. You do need to just explain and provide some evidence of what you've done, but it's simply just a checkpoint. Okay, any other? Well, let's take a pause and ask for questions about the second assignment then, or first assignment if you've still got questions about that, or questions about the completion activities. Any questions on your assessment? The second assessment due date, that will be definitely set down in the course profile. Let me just check for you. Just bringing that up now. Okay, having some difficulty getting to it. It's probably quicker for you guys to get to that than for me, unfortunately. So it brings all the courses that I'm involved in up rather than just your own. But the course website has it due on the 15th of September is incorrect. Or is it? Let me just double check that. That's probably about right. Yes, 15th of September. So let me just check again. The date that Nia had mentioned around 28th of October can't be correct because that would put you well beyond the end of semester. So I'm not sure where that 28 October date is coming from, but 15 September looks correct. Friday, not Thursday, 15th. Yes, you'd then be going to school holidays, but it is on the Thursday. No, it's on the 15th of September is a Friday. Where did the Thursday concept come from? Oh, the web page is saying Thursday. Oh, it's a bit strange. Oh, because it's saying 2016. I'll correct that. Let me just check the course profile then, because that is the final arbiter in all things to do with assessment. And I wouldn't want to steer you wrong from anything it says there. Let me just check here. Yes, everything's set as due on the 15th of September in your course profile. So that's the official date, and there's no aspect about that. I'm not sure where this date of 28th of October has come from, but yes, everything's due on the 15th of September. 2017. Yes, you've got a little bit over 2 weeks. Well, really 3 weeks if you count this as a full week. Well, I'm afraid that we are constrained by our assessment boards and when things have to be compiled and completed. And unfortunately for you guys, most of our other courses finish after only 9 weeks. And everyone sort of finalizes those. These are sort of our more extended courses. But the university requirements, particularly now that we've moved to tri-semesters with a much shorter time frame between the semesters, there's a lot less freedom for us to extend the time frames. Emma asks us, can we transfer information from assignment 1? You can use anything you want from assignment 1 in assignment 2. And indeed, there's some particular sections so that's encouraged. Let me bring up assignment 2 for you and we'll go through that just to clarify. Where are we? Absolutely, Damien. You could use your ideas that you developed from your futures plan to lead into assignment 2. That was very much intended. So hopefully you're seeing my screen. Yep, looks like it. So here's assignment 2 again. Now, last week we talked about creating vision statements. You will need to create a vision statement about what you would like to have your organization achieve. And it needs to include consideration of pedagogy, curriculum, and technology. You'll need to identify the stakeholders, the people that are interested in the success of your endeavor. And they can, of course, be parents and students and other staff, your administrators, the community and businesses and so forth. You'll then do a systems analysis of that, which can be very much based on the systems analysis you did for your first assignment, where in that case, you were mostly just looking at the technology Now you need to look at the entire organization and how that could be impacted by that change in technology. Identify the differences between your vision and your current organization's systems analysis. So essentially what that is looking at what you actually need to change in terms of your organization to achieve your vision. Now, it may be a very simple thing of just introducing the technology, but it's more than likely going to be a whole range of additional things, such as maybe changing their attitudes to certain technologies, perhaps changing their attitudes to certain pedagogies, or changing their attitudes to the curriculum in terms of embracing a new aspect of the curriculum. In particular, digital technologies is an important one at the moment, or it may be ICT integration or a whole range of other aspects that you might need to look at. But essentially what you're doing is creating a vision, looking at your existing system, your organization and the system involved around that organization, working out then how to actually move from your current organization in terms of the system that it's involved in to the vision that you would like to achieve. And you then need to describe that and plan that out over a 1, 5, and 10-year time frame. And then identify some of the key changes that are going to be needed in your organization to achieve that changes that you want to see happen. And finally, then there'll be a set of proposed actions that will be needed to be implemented to achieve those changes. And you'll need a management plan, which we'll go through next week in terms of the steps needed to manage that process. And then I've given you a breakdown of some suggested words in terms of word limits around those various steps. You can change those as you wish to get across your ideas. And if we look at the rubric, which is always the final arbiter of assessment, you'll see that there's 25% for your vision and how it progresses from your identified systems analysis, your socioeconomic system of your existing organization, how you've identified the stakeholders and how your systems analysis has helped in working out what the different stakeholders would need, what they would want to have see achieved, like what the students would like to see achieved, what the teachers would like to see achieved, what the administration, what the parents, etc. Each of those groups will have various change levers, which will be the things that you will need to do to bring them on board with the change that you envisage. So to get the students on board, it may need to be something around achieving results in terms of their learning or their assessment, or just having fun and engaging. For parents, it may be a whole range of other things, particularly around employment opportunities and things that are interested for the parents. For other groups, there may be different things that you need to make sure you address. For parents, it might be the cost involved. And then you'll need an evaluation and how you're going to manage that change. Okay, since everyone's typing questions, I'll need to just read now. The quizzes, etc., you'll need to present your log of learning activities, which can include the quizzes. But if you want to include, you can only include ones you've completed. So yes, if you want to include quizzes, you'll need to get them done beforehand. There are quite a number of quizzes, and you can include as many of those as you need to. You will note that you can achieve a lot more points than you need to. So doing all the quizzes, attending all the videos, doing the readings will take you over the maximum number of points you can achieve. So you don't have to achieve everything for that task. And yes, you can get them done already. So Yeah, the quizzes aren't designed to be done in sequence. They're just there to help you clarify the readings for each week. Okay, so you should have a reasonable framing of what the implementation plan is about. It's taking some ideas around, generally as the base of this course, around introduction of some sort of technology into your organization and coming up with a plan of how that will be achieved. But the key aspects are you have to identify a vision, you have to identify your stakeholders, and you have to work out ways of influencing those stakeholders so that they adopt your vision. And then there's some management processes that we'll go through that you can also consider. Any questions about that at this stage? It's a relatively straightforward process, but as with any assignment, there are nuances and so forth, but the criteria are there and you need to try to address those criteria. The other elements are framing to help you achieve that criteria and meet those elements of the rubric. That'd be a good thing, Eric. Okay, well, let's get into the content for this week so that it will help you then for your assignment. So we've got a few readings. Now, is everyone seeing? Yes, you are. Good. Okay. Now I can follow through with your comments. Okay, so Chandler puts forward a comparison of traditional versus progressive education. So what we're looking here is around the idea of not just introducing technology, but also introducing some changes to how we teach, because technology can enable different ways of teaching or can support ways of teaching that we may not have been able to achieve or wanted to achieve without the use of technology. So there's lots of different approaches to that. It may be still a very teacher-directed direct instruction pedagogy, and that's fine. There's technologies that can assist with doing that. PowerPoint and learning management systems and digital texts. Or it might be a project-based pedagogy or a whole range of other different approaches that technology can assist with. It could be some of the social pedagogies where students are engaged with trying to change society with community-based projects and things of that nature. So however you wish to see things changed in your organization, it doesn't just have to be the technology that changes. It can also, excuse me, it can also be how the teaching in that organization changes. And it can also be about how the content changes in that organization. So it may be different approaches to that aspect. More specifically, we see that in schools that embrace different curriculum, such as the International Baccalaureate or the Montessori schools and things of that nature. But it can also be just a range of other approaches. There are schools that unitize their curriculum, particularly in F to 10, where students do very short courses and they're all structured around these little units. And there are other schools that frame projects that go across an entire year. So there's different approaches that you can explore in terms of content and curriculum as well. So there's those three aspects that you do need to consider: the technology, the pedagogy, and the content. But first off, we're looking at the pedagogy. So Chandler explores how various innovations in education have been challenged by supporters of more traditional approaches to education. Now, he does focus on the American approach, but he he draws out from some of the major influences, particularly from Dewey, who we'll talk about in a second, but also some of the other key influences around pedagogical change. Now, he uses the term progressivist, and particularly in that respect around the concept of constructionism. And we see that in many of our pedagogy today around constructionism, but also connectivism and a number of other pedagogies that have emerged out of constructivism. But essentially, it's around students constructing their own learning rather than receiving knowledge and replicating an existing body of knowledge that the teacher or whatever other structure you wish to utilize, and students take on an existing body of knowledge that has been provided for them. And then there's a whole range of pedagogical approaches to assist them in that process, through to the more progressive approaches where students create their own understanding of concepts. Now, of course, there's an overlap between both, but that's the basic fundamental changes between those two. Jump in any time with any questions. So I'm really just going through briefly the readings, and it does assist if you ask questions about the readings. Okay, so traditional schools are those that focus on academic standards in particular, and do tend to be follow a very direct instruction approach. And direct instruction is having a resurgence of interest. A number of schools are taking on direct instruction as a whole of school pedagogical model, just as some schools are taking on a whole of school constructivist model. I would probably argue that taking on any one model is probably not the most advisable approach, because there are times when a direct instruction approach is an appropriate pedagogical strategy, just as there are times when a constructivist project-based approach is a more suitable pedagogical approach. And they can often complement each other very strongly, because a more traditional approach of direct instruction tends to be more effective for the lower order thinking skills of knowledge and procedural processes, whereas constructivism and other pedagogical approaches that would fit in the progressive framework tend to be more focused on higher order thinking skills, such as analysis and synthesis and evaluation and things of that nature. But what are your thoughts around that? These two dichotomies of traditional versus progressive, or direct instruction versus constructivism. What are your thoughts around the different pedagogical approaches being utilized in schools?
With ACARA, the of the more progressive approach to teaching, where they teach skills rather than just content.
Yes, certainly to a large extent, ACARA has been framed around the more progressive approaches, particularly around the thinking skills and the higher order frameworks that the curriculum has embraced. That said, in Queensland, with our QTAA, we're probably drifting back more towards a traditional approach, as emphasised by the works of Mazzano and the reframing, particularly of our senior curriculum at the moment, around external assessment.
And that would be the pressure for schools to do really well with their NAPLAN results.
To a certain extent, yes, there is that national aspect around NAPLAN. But in Queensland in particular, there's also competition between states at a senior outcomes level. And Queensland has achieved less than Victoria and New South Wales in particular in our senior performance as measured against the ATAR rankings. One aspect of that was because we had 1 year's less of schooling, but regardless of that, there has been a move towards trying to address that perception of inadequacy in our curriculum, and that is the current changes in the QCAA in terms of senior assessment.
I don't know if this is slightly off topic. I did see on the news, or on just reading the news at school today, Finland they're hoping that they will eventually not have any subjects at all, just so that they can start to be that I guess further step of progressive teaching, because they have a more holistic approach. I don't know, I just found that an interesting thing on the news today about their approach to progressive teaching, which is quite different to ours here in Australia.
Yes, Finland and the Nordic countries in particular have been very much known for progressive education. They do have certain advantages in being a very homogeneous group without a lot of diversity. So there are some things that we can learn from them, but there are some difficulties in replicating their particular model in countries such as Australia. But yes, they have embraced progressive education and constructivism very strongly, and they're now, because they're a progressive country, they are continuing to refine that and are moving towards now a system whereby they won't have a focus on disciplines. They will still have some aspects of structure around subjects, but they want to see a much more integrated approach and breaking down the silos that have formed around various disciplines that do make cross-curricular integration more complex. And that's much easier to achieve with progressive approaches, particularly around project-based learning. Indeed, if you get involved in that into any significant extent, it really does demand an integrated approach. Whereas a more direct instruction approach can focus around specific concepts based within disciplines and the most efficient ways of achieving that. And because they're focused on the lower order thinking skills, they don't need to worry so much about the development of the higher order thinking skills. Whereas Finland and some other countries that have gone down that very strong progressive approach tend to focus more on the higher order thinking skills. But in doing that, they've also achieved very well on the lower order thinking skills as measured in the PISA and other international rankings. Singapore is another country that has achieved very highly in those rankings. And they would definitely have been described as a traditional approach in the past, but they've recognized the limitations of that in focusing on the lower order thinking skills and are now reframing their entire system to focus on progressive approaches and higher order thinking skills. Again, they're fairly unique in that they're a very small system and are known for being very dynamic and innovative in their approaches. So it's difficult to replicate their processes across large systems such as Australia. But that said, there's a lot we could again learn from the approaches that they're taking. Now,
is there a balance that schools can take, I mean, with both approaches?
Absolutely. And that's the argument that would generally come into play. It's only those that take a very dogmatic approach. But that said, there are plenty of schools that are taking a quite dogmatic approach of direct instruction and only direct instruction, or constructivism and only constructivism, or even to the very high extremes of discovery learning and some of those approaches, which have pretty much been proven to be unworkable in large scale.
Would you say that the direct instruction approach has been successful in rural and Aboriginal communities in Queensland?
That's another tricky one.
Because my thoughts were that they tried and maybe had some success, but in the end, it really wasn't what the communities were after.
Direct instruction will have immediate success around the measures that are available to measure those levels of success. It's much easier to measure success around direct instruction approaches than it is around other progressive approaches. But that said, while you may achieve a short-term success, then moving students from beyond that to long-term success, particularly in the higher order thinking skills, can be much harder because you've locked things down into approaches that will achieve short-term success, but often at the cost of the flexibility of achieving long-term success in those more complex outcomes that we want students to achieve.
Is that to do in regards to, like, for example, Bloom's taxonomy, where just remembering things is at the bottom of the pyramid, but being creative is the more harder part?
Correct. And for better or for worse, a lot of our measurement tools are focused around that remembering and simple processes, because they're the things more easily measured and measured in a way that's quite valid. We can get a lot of strong validity around those measurement tools. Measuring creativity and some of the other higher order thinking skills are much harder to achieve a high level of validity. You can't just do a whole lot of multiple choice tests around that. You can look at students' outcomes, and that's what countries are doing in terms of the creative outputs and the innovative processes and entrepreneurship that students emerge with and things of that nature. And that's where the progressive approach has its strength. But in terms of the lower order thinking skills, it's not so much. And while Singapore and Finland have achieved success in the lower order thinking skills as measured in the PISA scores and the other international rankings, that has been much harder to replicate in larger systems such as Australia and the United States and most other countries in Europe, because of the diversity and complexity of our systems. And you can't, it's a lot harder to put in place a system that's very well managed, because we've got, even in Australia, different states doing different things around the Australian curriculum and a whole lot of other things that mess up approaches to do a very complex change to a large system. Not to say we shouldn't still keep trying, but it's harder to replicate what the successes have been in Singapore and Finland and in some of the city-states in China here in Australia. Now, just been a few other questions I see coming through. Emma's asked, I think they depend on the school and the level of teaching of those who will implement them. Absolutely, Emma. And she has explicit instruction in her schools, and all teachers must follow that. And yes, that's often a case with these methodologies, because it's seen that in order to get the best results from a particular approach, that it should be the focus that everyone gets behind. And in some cases that is correct, but that then comes at a cost if that one approach doesn't address all aspects of the educational environment that we want to achieve. And unfortunately, with the direct instruction, or the traditional versus the progressive, there does seem to be strengths of both, and having one combined approach doesn't really seem to be the best approach either. It seems to be that we need to do elements of both when they're needed. There's no one model that's emerged that includes both. Now, Eric mentions that the principals and the teachers, I'm not too sure what you meant there, Eric. You might need to refresh on that. Damien also has moved towards the direct instruction pedagogy. And yes, there is that whole aspect of students being trained to work within a particular system and to optimize their performance in a particular system, and then have difficulties when they are faced with other systems, such as going to university, which doesn't have a direct instruction model, or at least, well, some elements of university education is more direct instruction, but there is a very strong move towards a progressive approach over time where students are required to become independent learners, though that is possible still within a direct instruction framework. Oh, excuse me. And yes, the entrepreneur projects and other project-based learning approaches do tend to be a move towards progressive approaches. And that can often be some way of incorporating elements of that within a more traditional schooling environment. Okay, so there's lots of comments in there. There's a few tables that do the comparison. Direct instruction tends to be focused around the teacher. Progressive schools tend to be focused around the students. Phonics is an approach relied upon often in traditional approaches, whole of language in the progressive schools, and there's that ongoing debate between that particular curriculum area. Directed instruction often relies upon drill and practice and worksheets and a lot of the online tutorial-based activities, including some game-based activities such as mathletics and things of that nature. Whereas progressive schools tend to rely upon student, or let's call it inquiry learning, which is sort of the term commonly used at the moment. Assessment in traditional schools tends to be relied upon set tests, tests of objectives, and are often norm referenced, while progressive schools have a focus around portfolios and often project-based and indeed collaborative project-based. Grades in traditional are often used to compare students and to encourage students to compete and to improve themselves in comparison to their peers. While in progressive approaches, they tend to be more narrative-based and talk about students' progress and improvement, regardless of comparison with their peer group. So a few other things there that you can explore, but there's a fairly clear distinction between the traditional approach and the progressive approach, and how schools negotiate that and encompass different aspects of that is a challenge. Now, you're going to face that same challenge in your second assignment with your implementation plan. Of course, any introduction of technology also has to come into some pedagogical environment. And you need to define the sort of pedagogy that you're going to be supporting in terms of your vision. And it may be a combination, it may be traditional, it may be progressive. It's up to you how you frame that. But what I'm most concerned about is that you do consider it and how the technology that you're going to be introducing will support that pedagogy. Of course, there are certain technologies that will be very supportive of certain technologies, certain pedagogies, but there are some cases where they would not be at all of use. In very strongly progressive environments, interactive whiteboards and other direct instruction focused tools. But likewise, social media and tools of that nature are not particularly useful in a more traditional schooling environment, whereas they may be very useful in a strongly progressive learning environment. So you'll need to consider the pedagogy that you're going to be encouraging in your implementation plan and how the technology impacts upon that. We won't go through the research process that they used there, but that's the main aspects that I wanted you to get out of that particular reading. Any questions or comments? This really is meant to be a dialogue, so you guys need to speak. There's no right or wrong answers, so please put forward your views and maybe try to start clarifying in your own mind what sort of vision you will have for your organization in terms of pedagogy.
Well, I kind of find from my experience, and I'm fairly young teachers, only my 6th year, speaking to older teachers, that they have a very traditional mindset, and it's really difficult to change it. And if you come in with a progressive attitude, they disagree often because there's not a lot of evidence that they've seen in their classroom to back up what you're trying to do and how you're trying to change things.
Absolutely, and that'll be some of the challenges that you'll need to address in your implementation plan about how to get certain stakeholders, and the different groups of teachers will definitely be part of that. But there also may be a very strong focus from your parents who have potentially gone through a more traditional educational system, and to get them on board would also need a fair bit of work. So you'll need to put forward an argument, and often this is where technology is used as the Trojan horse for pedagogical change, whereby we can show that certain higher order thinking skills can be supported by technologies that might support project-based work or collaborative work, or engaging with experts around the world, or going on virtual field trips, or whatever particular approach that might be involved. But likewise, you may be in a more progressive school and you want to focus on some aspects around direct instruction. And there are a range of technologies that have come out more recently, particularly around machine learning and some of the learning management systems that can track students' learning down to a whole range of different criteria and categories. And that can really support a direct instruction approach if you want to go down that particular pathway. I don't want to flavor your pedagogical approach by one or the other, but you do need to consider it and identify the different people that will have differing views to what you want to achieve, and think through the arguments that you're going to put to bring them on board with your change.
Jason, what if we've got a bit of a clash with them? I know for me, when I'm in my English classroom, my approach is very traditional, but when I'm in my art classroom, it's 100% progressional. So when we have that, I guess, clash of ideas, do you prefer us to go one way, like focus on one particular area, or can I look at both? Or, because I know I do sort of approach both, but I don't also want to overcomplicate things.
No, that's where you bring in the third framework, which is your content or your curriculum. And it's very appropriate to consider things differently. The main one in most schools is mathematics, which really does almost rely upon, I should say maths, rely upon a more traditional approach. And it's very difficult to shift the teaching of mathematics towards a progressive approach, because it does rely upon a whole series of learnings that are really strongly supported by a traditional approach. But that said, there are other subjects. Design and technology and digital technologies, for example, is almost impossible to teach from a traditional approach, but it works in very well with many of the progressive approaches. Art is similar, but there are other subjects. Science is in a bit of a both sort of a area, where it has inquiry-based learning, but also elements of direct instruction. History is probably more leaning towards the traditional approaches, but there are teachers that have gone and done some very progressive approaches around students engaging in projects and creating their own virtual historical environments, and lots of different ways that they've done in that area. So absolutely, the content will also flavor what you're looking at, and you can address various different content areas because you'll have different stakeholders. So some of your stakeholders, say from the arts teachers, will want to see one particular thing, and you'll need to have arguments for them. But your other classes, say in English, you may have to have other arguments.
So perhaps provide guidance for both, to cater for both sets of stakeholders, those traditional and those progressive, and provide arguments that both sides will agree with, or give them something to agree with?
you may need to have different arguments for different groups. It may not be the same argument. They'll both need to get on board with the same vision. So your vision will need to encompass everyone. But for example, for a maths group, your argument around a particular introduction of a technology may be that it supports direct instruction and different ways that it's going to support that approach and get them on board from that perspective. But for your art teachers, it may be how the technology supports a progressive approach. And you may not decide upon trying to get everyone on board with one particular pedagogical approach. Or you may take a different approach completely and say, okay, we're going to get everyone on board progressive education. And in order to move the teachers that are very strongly focused on traditional approaches, I'll take the example again of maths teachers, it may be about how technology can assist them in getting students to take on, say, an inquiry approach where they can explore in an integrated way with other subjects how maths can support that. And that may be your approach of an integrated approach to get the maths teachers that were being very focused around a more traditional educational approach to embrace a pedagogical change. But it comes down to what the change is you want to see achieved. It may be just technology, it may be just pedagogy, it may be just content, although that's a bit harder given that's often externally implemented. But you define in your vision what the things you want to have achieved. In your systems analysis, you look at what the current situation is in your environment, and then you need to think through in your implementation plan how to move from that current situation to what you want to have achieved. And you get to frame what that change is. So it may be just a change in technology, it may be a change in pedagogy, it may be a change in both. It may even be a change in content if you wanted to introduce some aspects around that. But yeah, again, from an assignment point of view, I'm not really concerned with what the change is that you want to achieve. It's really that you go through the process of enabling that change to occur. Of course, I'd like to see some aspect of technology, given that that's the nature of this course, but you're free to have very different approaches in terms of what changes you want to occur. Okay, so Dewey, who really did frame the progressive movement, also makes a discussion around traditional versus progressive, particularly in defense of progressive education. So there's that document there that's fairly short, but you can have a look at. And it really focuses in on some of the philosophy of what you're trying to encompass. Now, in some organizations, you may want to have everyone adopt the same philosophy. That's fairly difficult to achieve. It has been achieved in some schools, such as some of the Montessori schools and other outlier schools in that nature. And even in some of our more traditional schools, particularly in some of our elite schools, they've got a very traditional approach to education. And if you want to be employed there, then you really do have to fit within that environment. But most schools have a mix of both. And your implementation plan will need to take that into consideration. Unless your plan is to move them to one of those extremes, which is also perfectly valid. But in general, you'll need to just define what you want achieved and the approaches. But you can draw upon these arguments that Dewey and the others are making about the differences between these approaches when you need to consider your different stakeholders. Of course, different people will have different perspectives on what they want to have happen, and you need to convince them that what they want can also be achieved in your organization. Or your plan may need to be that you need to get rid of some people. That's often a poorly implemented plan.
That doesn't work.
Yes, it's fairly difficult to do.
I've seen it happen, and it doesn't do very well for the rest of the staff morale, even those that are on board.
Absolutely, it's very rarely an advisable approach, but there have been instances where people have really wanted a particular vision to be achieved, and there are certain people in their organisation that just would never get behind that vision, and that may be a valid option, but it does come with a great cost. And can be much harder to implement. So yeah, it's not an advisable approach, but it is a valid approach that can be done.
If you do it really subtly.
Well, it also depends upon your time frame. And again, remember, we're looking at up to a 10-year time frame for your implementation plan. So often if you set in place a very strong vision and really support it and get enough people behind it, over time, some of the most intransigent people will make some change and concessions, and those that can't will move on. But part of that can also be setting in place clear expectations for anyone coming into the organisation about what the expectations are. And so anyone coming in terms of inflow, say in a systems model, will add to your particular vision, and the outflow will take away those that are opposed to it. And over time, then by natural attrition, you'll tend to get more alignment towards your vision. But that can be a very long process. Okay, so that's the Dewey document. Now, next one, called The Science of Learning, focus in on some of the more recent research around what we know about pedagogy, and goes through some of the aspects that can be considered. So we've got a series of what are called cognitive principles. Excuse me. Now, this very much tends to align more towards the progressive educational spectrum, but it is less, it has more backing. A lot of the progressive approaches, particularly around discovery learning and the more extremes, were strongly shown to be ineffective in the 70s and 80s. And so that has really led to a more closer alignment towards the direct instruction and traditional approaches in the 90s and the 2000s. And now we're starting to see a little bit more of a re-examination of where progressive education can go again, particularly bringing on some of our understanding from brain research and other aspects of learning. So that's why I've included this one. And a lot of this is also adopted by the traditionalists. Of course, cognitive science hasn't really emerged from educational philosophy. It's emerged from psychology. And so it hasn't been divided into the two camps of progressive and traditionalist. And so a lot of the elements of cognitive science does tend to be able to fit within both, and can be a mechanism of bridging the gap between the two. It also has a little bit of an advantage in, because it's very much science-based, it can overawe certain people. You can sort of say that all of this evidence exists for particular approaches. Now, there's been a pushback against that because some people went too far with making claims around cognitive science, and they were then proven to be unsupported. And in the main, they were educationalists who took the idea from psychology and cognitive science and tried to frame educational theories around that, and did a particularly poor job of it. And so there's a bit of a negative tarnishing of cognitive science in some respects. But at its underlying principles around psychology and the cognitive science per se, it does have a lot of validity and strength. So there's elements that you could consider around what we've learnt in more recent years around cognitive science and around how students can process knowledge from working memory to long-term memory. And that fits in very nicely with traditional approaches. But it also has elements of some of the other educational philosophies and methodologies, particularly around behaviorism, which did get a bit of was sort of dismissed from both camps, direct instruction and the progressives for a while. But a lot of the things we're learning around cognitive science does support many of the concepts that were presented in behaviorism around how to actually get students to change their behavior based upon certain actions that can be put into place. And that can be the more traditional actions, which can often involve reward and punishment and things of that nature, through to progressive approaches. And we're seeing some of that coming out in game-based learning and other approaches to get students engaged, particularly in the higher order thinking skills around entrepreneurship and things such as X thinking and solving for X and trying to change the world in various other social agendas, and getting students engaged at that level, which is very much a progressive approach to education. So elements in there around cognitive science that you can consider, just so that you're not totally stuck within the progressive and traditionalist approaches, but there's also the cognitive approach that provides another alternative. There hasn't been too many schools that have decided to go strongly around cognitive science in the main, because the ideas that are coming out of cognitive science really only work in the laboratory. And when I talk about laboratory, I mean with psychologists working one-on-one with students or learners, and they don't really have any transition into whole class or whole school environments at this stage. People are starting to look at how to transition the ideas and what's been learnt in cognitive science and how to make them useful in a real learning environment in schools. But at the moment, most of the theories and ideas have been developed, have worked when you've got a single learner, often sitting in a cubicle with being shown a series of slides or set activities that you would imagine a psychologist would put people through. So how they can then be translated into a schooling environment is yet to be fully articulated. But there are people that are taking lots of the ideas that we're getting from the psychologists and cognitive scientists and thinking through what that might mean for implementation in a whole school environment. So a whole series, excuse me, of ideas there that you can consider around, again, your different pedagogical approaches that you might wish to incorporate into your vision statement. And Eric's about to lose his battery. Oh dear. Okay, Eric. Well, you'll be able to watch the remainder of this in the video, no doubt, and you can ask questions again next week. So does anyone have any comments or comments or things you want to raise about cognitive science and the elements that that can introduce into your implementation plan?
I think that there are parts of these cognitive principles that you could actually borrow from to help argue the case to implement your change.
Absolutely. And that's what I'd like you to think about. And you may find that you can draw from a whole range of different philosophies and approaches, and you don't have to sit strongly within a single camp. You do need, well, for the purpose of this assignment, you can draw from anything. Ideally, if you're really going to do a true implementation plan, you should try to define your philosophy and also then work with your stakeholders and get everyone to work towards developing a consensus philosophy, what we discussed last week in particular, because that can gain a lot more buy-in and a lot more commitment from everyone if they've all worked on creating the vision and the approach that you want to see occur. Now, not every leader takes that approach. Often they'll decide upon one, and you can take it as you've gone through that approach for your assignment. Because obviously for your assignment, you don't have the time and the processes to go through developing a consensus from all the stakeholders. You can state your vision, and you can even say that you've actually developed this as a consensus from the various stakeholders, because that can then make it easier for you to argue different ways of getting everyone on board, because part of that is having them be involved in the process.
So for example, if you took an instructional leadership approach and you could hypothetically discuss how you consulted with the stakeholders and gave them a voice before you came up with the vision.
Absolutely. And I would encourage you to do that. And the assignment is very much framed around you going through that process. And part of what we did for the Delphi process was to model how you can build consensus in a fairly organized way towards getting some ideas that everyone agrees upon. Now, you can't just leave it at that, though, because people will have their own agendas, and you need to understand those agendas. And in the main, the most successful implementation plans work towards assisting everyone achieving their agendas. And the difficulty is then if there are any opposing agendas, where you've got different groups wanting different things, or in worst case, you wanting something different to what certain groups want. And then there needs to be some negotiation and conciliation around what's achievable. And often, as a leader, you need to then work out ways of getting people to either change their mind, or in some cases, opposing what they want achieved for the better good of everyone. But ideally, the best system is to get everyone on board and to modify any opposing views so that either a consensus or one group prevails over another group in terms of achieving the vision that you want achieved.
Could you implement like a part of distributed leadership where you give roles to people so that they feel as if they're taking control of it? In particular, maybe stakeholders that are perhaps going to resist, like give them a role or something to do.
No, absolutely, and that's certainly one of the strategies we'll talk about, I think, next week in terms of the implementation plan. The only care you need to take in that is giving power, which distributed leadership really is about distributing power and power to influence change. And you need to do so in a way that still achieves the overall vision that you would like to have. And there is one approach that is to allow the vision to emerge dynamically, where you don't actually have a commitment to any particular outcome, that you just guide the process of everyone working towards a consensus outcome. Unfortunately, this assignment's not really structured to permit that approach. Of course, you do need to state a vision and have an implementation plan to achieve that vision. But it is an approach that a leader can take in an environment, be it a classroom or a whole school, where you simply take a guidance role and you let the consensus emerge without trying to actually have that consensus be one that you are directing. But as I said, that's not one that you can actually do for this assignment. You do need to actually state a vision that you want achieved.
Yeah, I think I know what you mean. It's like you've already gone through all of that process, and now here's the choice that you as a leader is making to progress the school forward, sort of thing.
Correct, yes.
Based on what everyone else, what the consensus is that everyone else has come up with here.
Yes. And And part of it too is also just for you to think through what the different viewpoints different people have. And particularly say, well, it comes down to some specific things. It's not just pedagogy, but say if around the technology, the cost involved. That's something you'll need to consider, and it's something that parents in particular have a strong view on. But it also may be that administrators would have a strong view on that. Say if you're as a classroom teacher, if you're going to frame your entire school around maker spaces and have students work throughout the day on projects and have the staff be available throughout the day for any student to come to and visit. And there are some schools that have taken on that approach and are doing some pretty good things. But that's a very progressive approach to education, and one that does need a lot of consideration of all the stakeholders in order to achieve that. And technology has certainly played a very strong role in allowing that to be successful in the cases where they have been successful. But you don't need to go to an extreme. You can just think through your own organisation and propose a relatively minor implementation vision. But I encourage you, if you wish to, and you won't be penalised for being more ambitious and framing a rather more significant change to your organisation that you've chosen. Okay, so that's that cognitive approaches. Now, the last one for you to look at is around the idea of teaching. And there's been a number of reviews that has explored what is effective teaching and what's less effective teaching. Mazzano and them have done their own work around this. This is another report. Wonderful, Damien. So this goes through and identifies 6 elements of really good, effective teaching. And I'll frame that as a good learning environment, because some of you may be looking at online education and other processes, but the concepts should still remain valid. So there needs to be good content knowledge, and that may be something you need to incorporate around the use of technology. So having good access to the internet can strengthen content knowledge, both for teachers and students, but also access to good resources. Traditionally, that's been a library, but progressively now we've got more video libraries and games, whole lot other tools that can support strong content knowledge. There needs to be good instruction. So there needs to be good processes to support students' learning. Now that may be direct instruction, that may be higher order projects, but there needs to be good processes of ensuring that students move from being novices in terms of understanding around concepts towards being more expertised around their understanding of various concepts and processes and everything else. And ideally, that should have plenty of evidence that supports it. There should be a really good learning environment. In this case, we call it classroom climate. But that can incorporate things around the behaviour management systems in a school, through to the ideas of student self-worth and of valuing students, but also around students being comfortable with failure and being willing to push themselves in terms of Vygotsky's hierarchy of learning and so forth, whereby if students are too obsessed with testing and assessment, they may limit themselves in terms of what they try to achieve. Particularly that's evident in the more progressive approaches, but it is one of the criticisms of the more traditional approaches. The way the traditional approaches achieve success around that is often in competitions, where students are pushed towards competing with one another to achieve a ranking within the organisation or within the system or within the country. But that can have negative consequences. A lot of students opt out of that competition and accept mediocrity when they may be able to have achieved more within that environment. But likewise, within the more progressive approaches, they very much push the idea of entrepreneurship and challenge-based learning, and the idea of failure and overcoming failure. And that has certain advantages, but it's also probably got some disadvantages around students. Students need to have a greater understanding of their own abilities in that environment. And certainly I find at a university level that a lot of students don't like that openness, because it's much easier to just rely upon a teacher saying you've got to do this and you'll be rewarded for this. Having to take on that responsibility yourself to understand the learning, understand yourself as a learner, and work out what needs to be achieved, and all of those elements, while they can achieve a much greater what's called metacognition and learning outcomes in the long term, they don't have as many short-term benefits. And there does need to be a balance to both. Yes, that whole aspect of being forced to think and challenged to think, but you need to understand that you've got different stakeholders. And even within one class, you've got some students that would love that environment where they're challenged and have got the self-confidence to explore things on their own and push the boundaries of what's being asked of them. And there are others that will react very strongly to that, saying, no, I want to be told what I need to do, and I want to be measured on based upon that demonstration of that achievement. And again, there are advantages to both approaches and disadvantages to both approaches. And yes, the whole aspect around hard learning is an important one, but when you're subject to it yourself, it can be frustrating. Of course, much of it does rely upon you developing that understanding yourself, where it's much easier in many respects for someone just to tell you. But that often doesn't achieve the greater learning outcomes that are possible. Classroom management is another big one. Actually just managing the environment, but that can also be a whole learning system. And we've got our learning management systems that help manage those levels. We've got behavior management systems. We've got cognitive management systems. There's a whole range of things that can help support the learning space. There's also teachers' beliefs. And this can be a really big one, particularly in, oh, excuse me, in the traditional systems where we often see things such as streaming, and teacher expectations can have a huge impact upon student outcomes. Where if a teacher expects students to achieve, often they will. But if they don't expect them to achieve, then often they won't. And that's often been a case around gender and other racial groups where expectations just weren't applied to students and they lived to those expectations, up or down. And that can be a big factor. It's also an important factor in the more progressive approaches, but I find that it's more around teacher expectations of what they can achieve with students, and whether or not students will actually rise to the occasion of project-based learning, for example, where a lot of the responsibility is put onto the students and taken off the teacher, where the teacher is used to managing those expectations and setting them and guiding the learning process. To put that onto the students takes away some of that responsibility and power from the teacher and puts it on the students. And from a teacher's perspective, particularly if they're judged on the outcomes of the students, that's quite a dangerous thing to do. But that said, there's a lot of evidence that shows that for many students, having that additional power and expectations, they will rise to that and achieve far greater outcomes than if the teacher had set the outcomes based upon the expectations of the normative group. And yes, self-efficacy levels are very much built into all of that, and a whole range of aspects around self-identity. Particularly for your staff, teachers have a particular identity of what it is to be a teacher. And for a traditional learning environment, traditional pedagogies, the teacher is the expert. They impart the knowledge, they guide the learning process of the students, and the responsibility very much of the learning is on the teacher. In the more progressive approaches, the responsibility shifts very much to the students. And the teacher is then as a supportive coach, but in some respects, a diminished role from a traditional perspective, where it's not their responsibility to ensure that the learning occurs. It's the responsibility of the students. It's the responsibility of the teacher to provide the environment that best encourages that learning to occur. But that does really challenge a lot of traditional teachers' understanding of what it is to be a teacher. And likewise, it can challenge the understanding of students of what it is to be a student. And in many cases, also challenge their understanding of what teachers should be. And that can extend to parents and sometimes even to administrators, where if their expectation of what a teacher is to be someone that actually directs the instruction, and you find that they're witnessing a progressive environment where the students are setting the tasks and even identifying the assessment processes, and doing what would in a traditional environment be the teacher's role, that can cause conflict or certainly misunderstanding. And if you want to advance different pedagogical approaches, then you need to consider how different stakeholders will perceive those changes and ensure that there are processes in place to bring them on board with those changes. And then there's the whole idea of what it is to be a professional. And again, that can be a problem for teachers. And we've seen that in our society over the last 20 or 30 years, where in the past, when we had a very, very strong traditional approach to education, and the teacher's knowledge was the expertise, and what they said was absolutely correct, and there was no argument, that had a certain standing in the community. Over time, particularly with the progressive approaches, that standing has been greatly eroded. And now we have a lot of parents challenging teachers in terms of what the learning processes should be for their students, and a whole range of different opinions on what should be occurring in learning that didn't used to occur when we had a very much a traditional approach to education. And that's something that needs to be considered, because even as a principal and administrator, those things can't exist. And yes, there's been a huge diminution of trust. When I moved from schooling into university education, that was one of the greatest things that I noticed. My teaching changed very little. The amount of trust and professional respect that was imparted to me changed dramatically. And that's something that we've lost in education, in schooling education, and something that you may want to consider as part of your implementation plan is something you might want to try to improve upon. I don't know if email is the entire cause of that change. Emails occurred in a lot of different environments. But yes, the level of professional respect has changed. And part of that may be too in that the stakeholders, in terms of particularly the parents and the community, haven't been fully brought on board with changes that have occurred in schools in recent years. And that may be something that needs to be addressed in your implementation plans. And yes, it is very easy to communicate feelings or miscommunicate feelings through the use of email. And yes, as a beginning teacher, that can be challenging because you do need to work within various frameworks, and often you've been taught a very progressive approach at university, and you may be going into a much more traditional approach in a schooling environment. And your content knowledge will sometimes be challenged But yes, there's lots of elements that come to developing your identity as a teacher and your role. But what we're really focused on in this course is around changes that you may wish to make. And sometimes you may be able to use inexperience as a mechanism to support change. People will be more forgiving of mistakes from people that are new to an environment. That's where often principals can do most changes that they want to achieve in a school in their first couple of years. And then as they are in a school for more than 5 years, it's much harder to make changes because people are no longer willing to allow your newness to a position to give you freedom to do things. Yes, Damien. Unfortunately, though, most of us don't have any experience of being plumbers, while everyone has had the experience of being a student at some point. So everyone thinks they understand education. Of course they don't, but that's where a lot of the ideas have come from. We did have a nice period in the 40s and 50s where we first began compulsory education, where a lot of parents hadn't been educated. And so there was a huge amount of respect given to teachers as a result of that. But familiarity breeds contempt, as the saying goes. And because everyone has experienced education to a much greater degree than they have most other professions, there is less respect given to educators in terms of their professional role. Now, that's something that we should be changing, but it's not something that's on a lot of agendas, and even for teachers. So unfortunately, it's something that we have to sort of live with and work with. But we are digressing a little. And no, I don't trust many of my mechanics. They always seem to find so many things wrong with my vehicle, but that's another story. Okay. The next thing, the frameworks that could help us capture great teaching and replicate that in an environment. Assessment of teachers is one thing that's been high on the mind of a lot of people. Part of it has to do with that level of trust, in that there's not a lot of trust given to teachers, even from our systems. So the idea is that if you don't trust professionals, then you work out ways of assessing them and making them compliant to what you want to have them do. That we're beginning to digress a lot from the ideas of this course, but they are important aspects that you do need to consider in an implementation plan. Because while you may come up with the greatest educational plan possible, you'll still need to get people on board who won't necessarily trust you as a professional, and you'll need to come to them with strong arguments. And sometimes those arguments need to be framed not in educational pedagogical terms. Of course, very few people outside of the teaching profession understands these ideas of constructivism or traditional education or direct instruction. They just don't have the language and the concepts to be able to engage with that discussion. So for some of your stakeholders, you'll need to present things in a very different way to what you might present to your peers in terms of educators or to your school administrators. But you'll still need to come up with these various different arguments and so forth. But there's a range of different approaches that have been put on how we can monitor our teachers. And indeed, some of these you may need to consider in your own plan for implementation. So say if you're a principal and you want to get everyone doing a particular approach in your school, then you may need to implement classroom observation. So actually observing what your teachers are doing, looking at value-added models. So actually trying to measure student learning outcomes, getting students to provide their own opinions on what's happening. And then there's the other approaches where you can rely upon the experienced teachers, department heads, principals, lead teachers to make their judgments. Teachers can do their own self-reporting. And then there could also be analysis of the evidence that's been generated, such as through teacher portfolios. But the idea is that if you want to enact change, then you do need to measure that change. And part of that is often measuring the performance of the people doing the change. And that can be the teachers. So while teacher assessment can often be seen as an external agenda, and in many cases it is, unfortunately, based around pay and professionalism and a whole range of other aspects around unionism is another agenda that's in place. There are valid reasons for professional assessment. And every profession does have a fairly strong assessment regime. Teachers have probably got one of the least intrusive assessment processes of the major professions. It's different to the trades. Trades in the main don't have an assessment regime. They've got a skill development regime, but all the professions tend to have a fairly strong process of self-monitoring the performance of the professionals in that profession. Certainly medicine does, law does, and most other professions. So while unfortunately the introduction of professional measurement into teaching hasn't been managed well. Of course, really teaching is still in the transition between being a trade to being a profession. And we're still going through those transitional processes. And a lot of our teacher education is still based around trade development, preparing people as tradespeople, rather than preparing teachers as professionals. So there's a lot of arguments for both, but again, we're diverging from the main focus of our discussion tonight. But any comments while I skip ahead? Yes, Damien, as you rightly comment, it's very controversial. So this document goes through in great detail some of those aspects. But the main bit I wanted you to incorporate into your implementation plan is around this measurement concept. You are going to need to work out ways of monitoring your implementation plan and ideally adjusting based upon that monitoring. So if you're going to want to have all your teachers start using iPads and doing really good activities, then you need to have some processes of seeing if that's occurring and ways of then adjusting your plan if it's not occurring or if it is occurring. It is a good document, but we need to remember undergraduate students are still developing what it is to be a teacher. And really, until you've been a teacher for a couple of years, it's very difficult to self-reflect upon what it is to be a good teacher. We try to provide a lot of skills and understanding in undergraduate courses, but the reality is until you've actually had your own class and you've bonded and got that whole aspect around guiding a group of students for a significant period of time, it's difficult to really understand these processes at a higher level. But it is a good reflection tool, and certainly it is very effective well, it can come down to an individual teacher using it as a tool to be self-reflective and to develop a cycle of improvement. But it can also be important for a group of teachers, say in a staff room or department, that could use it, through to a whole school. And increasingly we are seeing schools implement these processes. Some schools are using technology to support this, such as video monitoring, and then all the teachers getting together and watching each other's on their videos and providing constructive feedback and processes. But the entire crux of it is around ongoing improvement. And if that's done effectively, then you can see some really dramatic change over some fairly short periods of time. And that can be something that you can build into your implementation plan. But if there's no feedback, and you could have people just decide not to do stuff. And your entire implementation plan can then fall apart. You can't just put entire trust on everyone to implement your plan, even if it's a collectively developed plan, without some leadership around monitoring that progress and providing the support and encouragement and ongoing push to see that vision achieved. Too many vision statements are developed and then just forgotten until the next time to develop a vision statement comes around. There really does need to be a plan around trying to achieve any such change. But let's get to some comments from you guys. I've been talking way too much. So what we've been framing this evening is around the idea of not just the technology that you're going to introduce into your implementation, but also the pedagogy and to a certain extent the content. But most of it, most importantly, is a process by which you're going to actually get people on board with the ideas that you wish to implement and how you're going to start measuring that implementation.
Does that tie into like making the implementation sustainable? So if you begin it, but then you move on to another job, it needs to continue, the process needs to actually continue within the school you started?
Well, there's that aspect, absolutely, and that's around leadership. And again, getting everyone on board or having enough leadership that's on board with it. And part of that could be distributed leadership or hierarchical leadership so that it's not reliant upon just a single person. But it's also sustaining it just in terms of its own momentum. A lot of changes develop fatigue after a relatively short amount of time. And part of your implementation plan, and part of it why it's broken into 1 and 5 and 10-year stages, is so that you can build in steps that introduce different things at different times. Part of that is because you don't want everything to occur at once, because that just becomes overwhelming. But also so that there's a constant sort of renewal of engagement with the initiative that you wish to see occur. If you set it all out at the start and then just say, everyone go ahead and do it all, after a couple of years, people are going to get sick of it, including yourself as a leader. Because one of the aspects around many leaders or innovators, remember we talked about that levels of innovation, and you've got the high levels of innovators, they want to constantly be doing something new. So if you set everything in place at the start, then after 2 or 3 years, people are going to want to start doing new things. And they'll then want to move away from your implementation plan. But if your implementation plan is staged in a way that introduces new things regularly, then that always provides an impetus for those natural innovators to be doing something new within your framework.
Does it have to stick within, like with the way you set the assignment at 1, 5, and 10, or could you change it to what, like 1, 3, 7, 10, or does it have to be 1? I mean, I'm happy to stay with 1, 5, and 10. Like, I don't know, does it?
You can add additional ones in, but because it's set in the actual task that it's 1, 5, and 10, you do really need to address that.
Fair enough.
Yeah. Like, I don't really mind, but it because it's stated, it is something that does really need to be adhered to, unless you can make a really good argument otherwise. But generally 1, 5, and 10
keep it simple.
Yeah, it's simply just there to make sure that you're looking at different short-term, medium-term, and long-term goals. And part of that is to also stage your progression. Emma asks, with implementing technology, how far can we make predictions with changes technology constantly goes through. A good point, Emma. You may want to look at categories of technology, say presentation technologies. Now that's going to continuously keep evolving. At the moment, we've got now projectors. We've got the ability to do 3D projection or 3D TVs. Over time, that will continue to evolve to where there are ways of being fully immersed in surround sound or surround vision. So things will keep changing around that class of technology. So there'll be some sort of presentation technologies. There may be also some sort of devices that people have. The moment tablets are sort of the latest thing. That'll continue to evolve, and it may be we'll have things where we're wearing rings that project out onto our surroundings around our hands, and we can then sort of see everything being projected from what we're holding. That may replace tablets. Who knows? Those technologies exist, but they haven't taken off. But there'll be some sort of interactive device where we interact with content. So things will continue to evolve in that nature. But that said, there will also be completely new things come in. We may get devices where we can download content straight into our brains. People are working on that. It's not inconceivable that will occur in the next 10 years. But for your implementation plan, you really do need to work on things that can currently be predicted. Now, if a completely new revolutionary technology comes in, such as what happened with smart devices, smartphones and mobile devices, or the internet, then an organization would have to completely redo their implementation plan and come up with a new one. So that may occur, but for your purposes for this assignment and for most implementation plans, you do need to make some considered ideas about where technology will go over a period of time. 10 years is very ambitious, but you should still aim for that, even though it may, in almost all certainty, need revision. And that's something we'll talk about in our final session. Most implementation plans don't go their full time frame. And a good implementation plan will have a review process built into it to change the implementation plan if the circumstances warrant. And again, your implementation plan may be just for a single classroom. And it could be for an individual teacher to implement some introduction of some new technologies over a period of time. And your stakeholders will be your students, your parents, the school administration, and things of that nature. Because of the nature of this course, we have to cope with students that might be looking at a nationwide level all the way down to individual teachers in a classroom space. It needs to be very broad in how we approach implementation plans, but a good implementation plan can be done at any level. So it may be just for your own classroom, or it might be for your department or group of teachers. But there'll still be stakeholders, there'll still be people that you need to get on board and convince of different things and for you to consider in your planning. Augmented reality is a technology that's being pushed. Augmented reality has died down a lot in recent years. VR has been pushed previously and is now currently being pushed again. Whether or not they take off as educational technologies is something that is undecided, but it is something you could consider around your implementation plan, and you could build an implementation plan around the use of that technology in a learning environment, and that would be a good implementation plan. It is, Damien, and that's why we look at a 10-year time frame. We are getting better, and now we can often implement in a 5-year time frame. But a new technology does take a little while, particularly if it's one that does impact strongly upon pedagogy. And that's where you need to make a very strong case for change of pedagogy if that's going to be incorporated. It's a good question, Emma. I'd probably prefer if you work towards the idea that you've got access to what you need for your implementation plan. To take the negative approach of limiting ourselves to what is currently available is problematic. Obviously, you do need to be reasonably realistic, but part of your implementation plan will be convincing people that it's worthwhile investing in the technology. And a good implementation plan is often used as part of that process of getting people to invest in the learning outcomes that you want to see achieved through your implementation plan. So I wouldn't want to see it be used as an excuse to just stay with current existing technologies because of the limitations of certain learning in spaces. We really want to keep pushing to see those spaces improved. And indeed, there are a lot of support, including financial, for remote environments. And part of that is having a good implementation plan that when that money does become available, you can say, okay, yes, this is what we'd like to achieve. If you can provide us with the resources, this is what the implementation plan is. And a well thought out implementation plan can go a long way towards achieving that access to the resources. Damien, in terms of trials, you can incorporate a staged process which can involve trialing. And that may be a strategy you use to get people on board to show it working on a smaller scale before implementing on a larger scale. But the danger in that is that you may not commit to a full implementation plan. So your implementation plan should be developed on the assumption that the trial is successful. If it turns out that it's not successful, then yes, you could then cancel the implementation plan and do a new implementation plan. But an implementation plan in itself has to rely upon the assumption that the trial is successful. Yes, that's the problem of having ongoing trials. That's why I don't like that term, because then it basically just means everyone can keep experimenting without committing to a system-wide or an overall implementation process. So a trial should always be leading into a full implementation. Certainly it's okay if the trial fails to then stop the implementation plan and then start again and do it, but there should always be a process of leading into a full implementation. Yes, assume the trial will succeed. But it is a good strategy to bring people on board so that you can make a proof of concept in a small scale and then get more people on board in that process. That's perfectly acceptable. Optimism is always the way to go. Pessimism never really gets people behind you. Well, I guess it might get other pessimists behind you. Okay, any other questions around what we've discussed and how this is leading into the development of your implementation plans or assignment 2? You really should be starting to think about a vision statement. Yes, you can. I'd probably prefer to see steps as you go, like come up with some sort of vision and you can start thinking about some implementation. And ideally, if you put this on the discussion board, then the feedback can go to everyone and you can all learn from it rather than just an individual learning from it. So we haven't talked a lot about the managerial processes, or we'll talk a little bit about it, but some of that will come through in the next 2 weeks. Next week, we're going to be looking in particular, let me just bring it up for you. We're going to be looking in more detail at some of these progressive approaches, and particularly some new emerging models that you may wish to incorporate into your planning. But I'll leave you for that to have a look at that, and we'll discuss that next week. Okay, any final questions or comments? Wonderful, Emma. Okay then, well, good night all, and I'll see you next week.